look, was then in his middle 40s. The son of a printer on a small farm journal in Minnesota, he had been a sales engineer and management consultant before joining Ford in 1947, and although he could not have known it in 1952, he was to have reason to look puzzled. As the man directly responsible for the Edsel and its fortunes, enjoying its brief glory and attending it in its mortal agonies, he had a rendezvous with destiny. In December 1954, after 2 years' work, the Forward Product Planning Committee submitted to the Executive Committee a 6-volume blockbuster of a report summarizing its findings. Supported by copious statistics, the report predicted the arrival of the American millennium, or something a lot like it, in 1965. By that time, the Forward Product Planning Committee estimated the gross national product would be $535 billion a year, up more than $135 billion a year, up more than $135 billion in a decade. As a matter of fact, this part of the millennium arrived much sooner than the forward planners estimated. The GNP passed $535 billion in 1962, and for 1965 was $681 billion. The number of cars in operation would be 70 million, up 20 million. More than half the families in the nation would have incomes of over $5,000 a year, and more than 40% of all the cars sold would be in the medium price range or better. The report's picture of America in 1965, presented in crushing detail, was of a country after Detroit's own heart. Its banks oozing money, its streets and highways choked with huge, dazzling medium-priced cars, its newly rich, upwardly mobile citizens racked with longings for more of them. The morale was clear. If by that time Ford had not come out with a second medium-priced car, not just a new model, but a new make, and made it a favorite in its field, the company would miss out on its share of the national boot. On the other hand, the Ford bosses were well aware of the enormous risks connected with putting a new car on the market. They knew, for example, that of the 2,900 American makes that had been introduced since the beginning of the automobile age, the Black Crow, 1905, the Black Crow, 1905, the Averageman's Car, 1906, the Bug, Mobile, 1907, the Dan Patch, 1911, and the Lone Star, 1920, among them. About 20 were still around. They knew all about the automotive casualties that had followed the Second World War, among them Crossley, which had given up altogether, and Kaiser Motors, which, though still alive in 1954, was breathing its last. The members of the Forward Product Planning Committee must have glanced at each other uneasily when, a year later, Henry J. Kaiser wrote in a valediction to his car business, "We expected to toss $50 million into the automobile pond, but we didn't expect it to disappear without a ripple." The Ford men also knew that neither of the other members of the industry's powerful and well-heeled Big Three, Motors and Chrysler, had ventured to bring out a new standard-size make since the former's LaSalle in 1927 and the latter's Plymouth in 1928, and that Ford itself had not attempted to turn the trick since 1938 when it launched the Mercury. Nevertheless, the Ford men felt bullish, so remarkably bullish that they resolved to toss into the automobile pond 5 times the sum that Kaiser had. In April 1955, Henry Ford, Breech, and the other members of the Executive Committee officially approved the Forward Product Planning Committee's findings, and to implement them, set up another agency called the Special Products Division, with the star-crossed Crave as its head. Thus, the company gave its formal sanction to the efforts of its designers, who, having divined the trend of events, had already been doodling for several months on plans for a new car. Since neither they nor the newly organized Krav outfit, when it took over, had an inkling of what the thing on their drawing boards might be called, it became known to everybody at Ford. And even in the company's press releases, as the E-Car. The EE, it was explained, standing for experiment. The man directly in charge of the E-Car's design, or to use the gruesome trade word styling, was a Canadian, then not yet 40, named Roy A. Brown, who, before taking on the E-Car and after studying industrial design at the Detroit Art Academy, had had a hand in the designing of radios, motor cruisers, colored, glass products, Cadillacs, Oldsmobiles, and Lincolns. Brown recently recalled his aspirations as he went to work on the new project. "Our goal was to create a vehicle which would be unique in the sense that it would be readily recognizable in styling theme from the 19 other makes of cars on the road at that time." He wrote from England, where, at the time of his writing, he was employed as chief stylist for the Ford Motor Company, Limited, manufacturers of trucks, tractors, and small cars. We went to the extent of making photographic studies from some distance of all 19 of these cars, and it became obvious that at a distance of a few hundred feet, the similarity was so great that it was practically impossible to distinguish one make from the others. They were all peas in a pod. We decided to select a style that would be new in the sense that it was unique and yet at the same time be familiar. While the e-car was on the drawing boards in Ford's styling studio, situated, like its administrative offices, in the company's barony of Dearborn, just outside Detroit, work on it progressed under the conditions of melodramatic, if ineffectual, secrecy that invariably attends such operations in the automobile business. Locks on the studio doors that could be changed in 15 minutes if a key should fall into enemy hands. A security force standing around, the clock guard over the establishment, and a telescope to be trained at intervals on nearby high points of the terrain where peekers might be roosting. All such precautions, however, inspired, are doomed to fail, because none of them provide a defense against Detroit's version of the Trojan horse, the job-jumping stylist whose cheerful treachery makes it relatively easy for the rival companies to keep tabs on what the competition is up to. No one, of course, is better aware of this than the rivals themselves, but the cloak and dagger stuff is thought to pay for itself in publicity value. Twice a week or so, Kraft, head down and sticking to low ground, made the journey to the styling studio where he would confer with Brown, check up on the work as it proceeded, and offer advice and encouragement. Kraft was not the kind of man to envision his objective in a single revelatory flash. Instead, he anatomized the styling of the e-car into a series of laboriously minute decisions. How to shape the fenders, what pattern to use with the chrome, what kind of door handles to put on, and so on and on. If Michelangelo ever added the number of decisions that went into the execution of, say, his David, he kept it to himself, but Kraft, an orderly-minded man in an era of orderly, functioning computers, later calculated that in styling, the e-car he and his associates had to make up their minds on no fewer than 4,000 occasions. He reasoned at the time that if they arrived at the right yes or no choice on every one of those occasions, they ought, in the end, to come up with a stylistically perfect car, or at least a car that would be unique and at the same time familiar. But Kraft concedes today that he found it difficult thus to bend the creative process to the yoke of system, principally because many of the 4,000 decisions he made wouldn't stay put. Once you get a general theme, you begin narrowing down, he says. You keep modifying and then modifying your modifications. Finally, you have to settle on something because there isn't any more time. If it weren't for the deadline, you'd probably go on modifying indefinitely. Except for later, minor modifications of the modified modifications. The e-car had been fully styled by midsummer of 1955. As the world was to learn 2 years later, its most striking aspect was a novel, horse-collar-shaped radiator grille, set vertically in the center of a conventionally low, wide front end, a blend of the unique and the familiar that was there for all to see, though certainly not for all to see, though certainly not for all to admire. In two prominent respects, however, Brown or Kraft or both lost sight entirely of the familiar, specifying a unique rear end marked by widespread horizontal wings that were in bold contrast to the huge longitudinal tail fins, then captivating the market, and a unique cluster of automatic transmission push buttons on the hub of the steering wheel. In a speech to the public delivered a while before the public had its first look at the car, Kraft let fall a hint or two about its styling, which he said made it so distinctive that, externally, it was immediately recognizable from front, side, and rear. And internally, it was the epitome of the push-button era without Wild Blue, yonder Buck Rogers concept. At last came the day when the men in the highest stratum of the Ford hierarchy were given their first glimpse of the car. It produced an effect that was little short of apocalyptic. On August 15, 1955, in the ceremonial secrecy of the Styling Center, while Kraft, Brown, and their aides stood by smiling nervously and washing their hands in air, the members of the Forward Product Planning Committee, including Henry Ford and Breech, watched critically as a curtain was lifted to reveal the first full-size model of the e-car, a clay one with tinfoil simulating aluminum and chrome. According to eyewitnesses, the audience sat in utter silence for what seemed like a full minute, and then, as one man, burst into a round of applause. Nothing of the kind had ever happened at an intracompany first showing at Ford since 1896, when old Henry had bolted together his first horseless carriage. One of the most persuasive and most frequently cited explanations of the Edsels failure is that it was a victim of the time lag between the decision to produce it and the act of putting it on the market. It was easy to see a few years later, when smaller and less powerful cars, euphemistically called compacts, had become so popular as to turn the old automobile status ladder upside down, that the Edsel was a giant step in the wrong direction. But it was far from easy to see that in fat, tail, Finney, 1955, American ingenuity, which has produced the electric light, the flying machine, the Tin Lizzie, the atomic bomb, and even a tax system that permits a man, under certain circumstances, to clear a profit by making a charitable donation, has not yet found a way of getting an automobile on the market within a reasonable time after it comes off the drawing board. The making of steel dies, the alerting of retail dealers, the preparation of advertising and promotion campaigns, the gaining of executive approval for each successive move, and the various other gavotte-like routines that are considered as vital as breathing in Detroit and its environs usually consume about 2 years. Guessing future tastes is hard enough for those charged with planning the customary annual changes in models of established makes. It is far harder to bring out an altogether new creation, like the e-car, for which several intricate new steps must be worked into the dance pattern, such as endowing the product with a personality and selecting a suitable name for it, to say nothing of consulting various oracles in an effort to determine whether, by the time of the unveiling, the state of the national economy will make bring out any new car seem like a good idea. Faithfully executing the prescribed routine, the Special Products Division called upon its Director of Planning for Market Research, David Wallace, to see what he could do about imparting a personality to the e-car and giving it a name. Wallace, a lean, craggy-jawed pipe puffer with a soft, slow, thoughtful way of speaking, gave the impression of being the platonic idea of the college professor, the very steel die from which the breed is cut, although, in point of fact, his background was not strongly academic. Before going to Ford in 1955, he had worked his way through Westminster College in Pennsylvania, ridden out the Depression as a construction laborer in New York City, and then spent 10 years in market research at time. Still, impressions are what count, and Wallace has admitted that during his tenure with Ford, he consciously stressed his professorial air for the sake of the advantage it gave him in dealing with the bluff, practical men of Dearborn. Our department came to be regarded as a semi-brain trust, he says with a certain satisfaction. He insisted, typically, on living in Ann Arbor, where he could bask in the scholarly aura of the University of Michigan, rather than in Dearborn or Detroit, both of which he declared were intolerable after business hours. Whatever the degree of his success in projecting the image of the e-car, he seems, by his small eccentricities, to have done splendidly at projecting the image of Wallace. I don't think Dave's motivation for being at Ford was basically economic, his old boss, Crave says. Dave is the scholarly type, and I think he considered the job an interesting challenge. One could scarcely ask for better evidence of image projection than that. Wallace clearly recalls the reasoning, candid enough, that guided him and his assistants as they sought just the right personality for the e-car. We said to ourselves, let's face it, there is no great difference in basic mechanism between a $2,000 Chevrolet and a $6,000 Cadillac, he said. Forget about all the ballyhoo, he said, and you'll see that they're really pretty much the same thing. Nevertheless, there's gotta be something in the makeup of a certain number of people that gives them a yen for a Cadillac in spite of its high price, or maybe because of its high price, or maybe because of it. We concluded that cars are the means to a sort of dream fulfillment. There's some irrational factor in people that makes them want one kind of car rather than another. Thing that has nothing to do with the mechanism at all, but with the car's personality, as the customer imagines it. What we wanted to do, naturally, was to give the e-car the personality that would make the greatest number of people want it. We figured we had a big advantage over the other manufacturers of medium-priced cars because we didn't have to worry about changing a pre-existent, perhaps somewhat obnoxious personality. All we had to do was create the exact one we wanted, from scratch. As the first step in determining what the e-car's exact personality should be, Wallace decided to assess the personalities of the medium-priced cars already on the market, and those of the so-called low-priced cars as well, since, The cost of some of the cheap cars' 1955 models had risen well up into the medium price range. To this end, he engaged the Columbia University Bureau of Applied Social Research to interview 800 recent car buyers in Peoria, Illinois, and another 800 in San Bernardino, California, on the mental images they had of the various automobile makes concerned. In undertaking this commercial enterprise, Columbia maintained its academic independence by reserving the right to publish its findings. Our idea was to get the reaction in cities among clusters of people, Wallace said. We didn't want a cross-section. What we wanted was something that would show interpersonal factors. We picked Peoria as a place that is Midwestern, stereotyped, and not loaded with extraneous factors, like a General Motors glass plant, Slay. We picked San Bernardino because the West Coast is very important in the automobile business, and because the market there is quite different, people tend to buy flashier cars. The questions that the Columbia researchers fared forth to ask in Peoria and San Bernardino dealt exhaustively with practically everything having to do with automobiles except such matters as how much they cost, how safe they were, and whether they ran. In particular, Wallace wanted to know the respondents' impressions of each of the existing makes. Who, in their opinion, would naturally own a Chevrolet or a Buick or whatever? People of what age? Of which sex? Of which social status? From the answers, Wallace found it easy to put together a personality portrait of each make. The image of the Ford came into focus as that of a very fast, strongly masculine car, of no particular social pretensions that might characteristically be driven by a rancher or an automobile mechanic. In contrast, Chevrolet emerged as older, wiser, slower, a bit less rampantly masculine, and slightly more distinguished. A clergyman's car. Buick gelled into a middle-aged lady, or at least more of a lady than Ford, sex in cars having proved to be relative, with a bit of the devil still in her, whose most felicitous mate would be a lawyer, a doctor, or a dance band leader. As for the Mercury, it came out as virtually a hot rod, best suited to a young buck racing driver. Thus, despite its higher price tag, it was associated with persons having incomes no higher than the average Ford owners, so no wonder Ford owners had not been trading up to it. This odd discrepancy between image and fact, coupled with the circumstance that, in sober truth, all four makes looked very much alike and had almost the same horsepower under their hoods, only served to bear out Wallace's premise that the automobile fancier, like a young man in love, is incapable of sizing up the object of his affections in anything resembling a rational manner. By the time the researchers closed the books on Peoria and San Bernardino, they had elicited replies not only to these questions, but to others, several of which it would appear only the most abstruse sociological thinker could relate to medium-priced cars. Frankly, we dabbled, Wallace says. It was a dragnet operation. Among the odds and ends that the dragnet dredged up were some that, when pieced together, led the researchers to report, by looking at those respondents whose annual incomes range from $4,000 to $11,000, we can make an observation. A considerable percentage of these respondents to a question about their ability to mix cocktails are in the somewhat category on ability to mix cocktails. Evidently, they do not have much confidence in their cocktail mixing ability. We may infer that these respondents are aware of the fact that they are in the learning process. They may be able to mix martinis or Manhattans, but beyond these popular drinks, they don't have much of a repertoire. Wallace, dreaming of an ideally lovable e-car, was delighted as returns like these came pouring into his Dearborn office. But when the time for a final decision drew near, it became clear to him that he must put aside peripheral issues like cocktail, mixing prowess, and address himself once more to the old problem of the image. And here, it seemed to him, the greatest pitfall was the temptation to aim, in accordance with what he took to be the trend of the times, for extremes of masculinity, youthfulness, and speed. Indeed, the following passage from one of the Columbia reports, as he interpreted it, contained a specific warning against such folly. Offhand, we might conjecture that women who drive cars probably work and are more mobile than non-owners, and get gratifications out of mastering a traditionally male role. But there is no doubt that whatever gratifications women get out of their cars, and whatever social imagery they attach to their automobiles, they do want to appear as women, perhaps more worldly women, but women. Early in 1956, Wallace set about summing up all of his department's findings in a report to his superiors in the Special Products Division, entitled The Market and Personality Objectives of the ECRA, and weighty with facts and statistics, though generously interspersed with terse sections in italics or capitals from which a hard-pressed executive could get the gist of the thing in a matter of seconds. The report first indulged in some airy, skippable philosophizing and then got down to conclusions. What happens when an owner sees his make as a car which a woman might buy, but is himself a man? Does this apparent inconsistency of car image and the buyer's own characteristics affect his trading plans? The answer quite definitely is yes. When there is a conflict between owner characteristics and make image, there is greater planning to switch to another make. In other words, when the buyer is a different kind of person from the person he thinks would own his make, he wants to change to a make in which he, inwardly, will be more comfortable. It should be noted that conflict, as used here, can be of two kinds. Should a make have a strong and well-defined image, it is obvious that an owner with strong opposing characteristics would be in conflict. But conflict also can occur when the make image is diffuse or weakly defined. In this case, the owner is in an equally frustrating position of not being able to get a satisfactory identification from his make. The question, then, was how to steer between the Scylla of a too-definite car personality and the Charybdis of a too-weak personality. To this, the report replied, capitalize on imagery weakness of competition, and went on to urge that in the matter of age, the e-car should take an imagery position neither too young nor too old, but right alongside that of the middling olds. Mobile. That in the matter of social class, not to mince matters, the e-car might well take a status position just below Buick and Oldsmobile, and that in the delicate matter of sex, it should try to straddle the fence, again along with the protean olds. In sum, and in Wallace typography, the most advantageous personality for the e-car might well be the smart car for the younger executive or professional family on its way up. Smart car. Recognition by others of the owner's good style and taste. Younger, appealing to spirited but responsible adventurers. Executive or professional, millions pretend to this status, whether they can attain it or not. Family, not exclusively masculine, a wholesome good role. On its way up, the e-car has faith in you, son. We'll help you make it. Before spirited but responsible adventurers could have faith in the e-car, however, it had to have a name. Very early in its history, Kraft had suggested to members of the Ford family that the new car be named for Edsel Ford, who was the only son of Old Henry, the president of the Ford Motor Company from 1918 until his death in 1943, and the father of the new generation of Fords, Henry, Benson, and Fords, Henry, Benson, and William Clay. The three brothers had let Kraft know that their father might not have cared to have his name spinning on 1,000,000 hubcaps, and they had consequently suggested that the Special Products Division start looking around for a substitute. This it did, with a zeal no less emphatic than it displayed in the personality crusade. In the late summer and early fall of 1955, Wallace hired the services of several research outfits, which sent interviewers armed with a list of 2,000 possible names to canvass sidewalk crowds in New York, Chicago, Willow Run, and Ann Arbor. The interviewers did not ask simply what the respondent thought of some such name as Mars, Jupiter, Rover, Ariel, Arrow, Dart, or Ovation. They asked what free associations each name brought to mind, and having got an answer to this one, they asked what word or words was considered the opposite of each name, on the theory that, subliminally speaking, the opposite is as much a part of a name as the tail is of a penny. The results of all this, the Special Products Division eventually decided, were inconclusive. Meanwhile, Kraft and his men held repeated sessions in a darkened room, staring, with the aid of a spotlight, at a series of cardboard signs, each bearing a name as, one after another, they were flipped over for their consideration. One of the men thus engaged spoke up for the name Phoenix because of its connotations of ascendancy, and another favored Altair on the ground that it would lead practically all alphabetical lists of cars, and thus enjoy an advantage analogous to that enjoyed in the animal kingdom by the aardvark. At a certain drowsy point in one session, somebody suddenly called a halt to the card, flipping and asked in an incredulous tone, "Didn't I see Bukes go by 2 or 3 cards back?" Everybody looked at Wallace, the impresario of the sessions. He puffed on his pipe, smiled an academic smile, and nodded. The card-flipping sessions proved to be as fruitless as the sidewalk interviews, And it was at this stage of the game that Wallace, resolving to try and wring from genius what the common mind had failed to yield, entered into the celebrated car naming correspondence with the poet Marianne Moore, which was later published in the New Yorker and still later in book form by the Morgan Library. We should like this name to convey through association or other conjuration some visceral feeling of elegance, fleetness, advanced features, and design. Wallace wrote to Miss Moore, achieving a certain feeling of elegance himself. If it is asked, who among the gods of Dearborn had the inspired and inspiriting idea of enlisting Miss Moore's services in this cause, the answer, according to Wallace, is that it was no god but the wife of one of his junior assistants, a young lady who had recently graduated from Mount Holyoke, where she had heard Miss Moore lecture. Had her husband's superiors gone a step further and actually adopted one of Miss Moore's many suggestions, Intelligent Bullet, for instance, or Utopian Turtletop, or Bullet Cloisonne, or Pastilogram, or Mongoose Civique, or Andante con Moto. Description of a good motor. Miss Moore queried in regard to this last. There is no telling to what heights the e-car might have risen, but the fact is that they didn't. Dissatisfied with both the poet's ideas and their own, the executives in the Special Products Division next called in Foote, Kohn in Vudit, the advertising agency that had lately been signed up to handle the e-car account. With characteristic Madison Avenue vigor, Foote, Kohn Belding organized a competition among the employees of its New York, London, and Chicago offices, offering nothing less than one of the brand new cars as a prize to whoever thought up an acceptable name. In no time at all, Foote, Kohn Belding had 18,000 names in hand, including Zoom, Zip, Benson, Henry, and Droff. If in doubt, spell it backward. Suspecting that the bosses of the Special Products Division might regard this list as a trifle unwieldy, the agency got to work and cut it down to 6,000 names, which it presented to them in executive session. "There you are," a Foote, Kohn man said triumphantly, flopping a sheaf of papers on the table. 6,000 names, all alphabetized and cross-referenced. A gasp escaped Kraft. "But we don't want 6,000 names," he said. "We only want one." The situation was critical because the making of dies for the new car was about to begin, and some of them would have to begin and some of them would have to bear its name. On a Thursday, Foote, Kohn Belding canceled all leaves and instituted what is called a crash program, instructing its New York and Chicago offices to set about independently cutting down the list of 6,000 names to 10, and to have the job done by the end of the weekend. Before the weekend was over, the two Foote, Kohn offices presented their separate lists of 10 to the Special Products Division, and by an almost incredible coincidence, which all hands insist was a coincidence, 4 of the names on the two lists were the same: Corsair, Citation, Pacer, and Ranger. Had miraculously survived the dual scrutiny. Corsair seemed to be head and shoulders above everything else, Wallace says. Along with other factors in its favor, it had done splendidly in the sidewalk interviews. The free associations with Corsair were rather romantic. Pirate, swashbuckler, things like that. For its opposite, we got Princess, or something else attractive on that order. Just what we wanted. Corsair or no Corsair, the e-car was named the Edsel in the early spring of 1956, though the public was not informed until the following autumn. The epochal decision was reached at a meeting of the Ford Executive Committee held at a time when, as it happened, all 3 Ford brothers were away. In President Ford's absence, the meeting was conducted by Breech, who had become chairman of the board in 1955, and his mood that day was brusque and not one to linger long over swashbucklers and princesses. After hearing the final choices, he said, "I don't like any of them. Let's take another look at some of the others." So they took another look at the favored rejects, among them the name Edsel, which, in spite of the 3 Ford brothers' expressed interpretation of their father's probable wishes, had been retained as a sort of anchor to windward. Breech led his associates in a patient scrutiny of the list until they came to Edsel. "Let's call it that," Breech said with calm finality. There were to be 4 main models of the e-car, with variations on each one, and Breech soothed some of his colleagues by adding that the magic 4, Corsair, Citation, Pacer, and Ranger might be used, if anybody felt so inclined, as the subnames for the models. A telephone call was put through to Henry, who was vacationing in Nassau. He said that if Edsel was the choice of the executive committee, he would abide by its decision, provided he could get the approval of the rest of his family. Within a few days, he got it. As Wallace wrote to Miss Moore a while later, "We have chosen a name, It fails somewhat of the resonance, gaiety, and zest we were seeking, but it has a personal dignity and meaning to many of us here. Our name, dear Miss Moore, is Edsel. I hope you will understand. It may be assumed that word of the naming of the e-car spread a certain amount of despair among the foot, cone-belting backers of more metaphorical names, none of whom won a free car, a despair heightened by the fact that the name Edsel had been ruled out of the fact that the name Edsel had been ruled out, competition from the first. But their sense of disappointment was as nothing compared to the gloom that enveloped many employees of the Special Products Division. Some felt that the name of a former president of the company who had sired its current president bore dynastic connotations that were alien to the American temper. Others who, with Wallace, had put their trust in the quirks of the mass unconscious believed that Edsel was a disastrously unfortunate combination of syllables. What were its free associations? Pretzel, diesel, hard sell. What was its opposite? It didn't seem to have any. Still, the matter was settled, and there was nothing to do but put the best possible face on it. Besides, the anguish in the Special Products Division was by no means unanimous, and Krav himself, of course, was among those who had no objection to the name. He still has none, declining to go along with those who contend that the decline and fall of the Edsel may be dated from the moment of its christening. Krav, in fact, was so well pleased with the way matters had turned out that when, at 11 o'clock on the morning of November 19, 1956, after a long summer of thoughtful silence, the Ford Company released to the world the glad tidings that the e-car had been named the Edsel, he accompanied the announcement with a few dramatic flourishes of his own. On the very stroke of that hour on that day, the telephone operators in Krav's domain began greeting callers with Edsel Division. Instead of Special Products Division, all stationery bearing the obsolete letterhead of the division vanished and was replaced by sheaves of paper-headed Edsel Division. And outside the building, a huge stainless steel sign reading Edsel Division rose ceremoniously to the rooftop. Krav himself managed to remain earthbound, though he had his own reasons for feeling buoyant. In recognition of his leadership of the e-car project up to that point, he was given the august title of Vice President of the Ford Motor Company and General Manager, Edsel Division. From the administrative point of view, this off with the old on with the new effect was merely harmless window dressing. In the strict secrecy of the Dearborn test track, vibrant, almost full-fledged Edsels, with their name graven on their superstructures, were already being road-tested. Brown and his fellow stylists were already well along with their designs for the next year's Edsel. Recruits were already being signed up for an entirely new organization of retail dealers to sell the Edsel to the public. And Foote Cone-Belding, having been relieved of the burden of staging crash programs to collect names and crash programs to collect names and crash programs to get rid of them again, was already deep in schemes for advertising the Edsel. Under the personal direction of a no less substantial pillar of his trade than Fairfax M. Cone, the agency's head man. In planning his campaign, Cone relied heavily on what had come to be called the Wallace prescription. That is, the formula for the Edsel's personality as set forth by Wallace back in the days before the big naming bee, the smart car for the younger executive or professional family on its way up. So enthusiastic was Cone about the prescription that he accepted it with only one revision: the substitution of middle-income family for younger executive, his hunch being that there were more middle-income families around than young executives, or even people who thought they were young executives. In an expansive mood, possibly induced by his having landed an account that was expected to bring billings of well over $10 million a year, Cone described to reporters on several occasions the kind of campaign he was plotting for the Edsel. Quiet, self-assured, and avoiding as much as possible the use of the adjective new, which, though it had an obvious application to the product, he considered rather lacking in cachet. Above all, the campaign was to be classic in its calmness. "We think it would be awful for the advertising to compete with the car," Cone told the press. "We hope that no one will ever ask, say, did you see that Edsel ad in any newspaper or magazine or on television, but instead that hundreds of thousands of people will say and say again, man, did you read about that Edsel? Or did you see that car? This is the difference between advertising and selling." Evidently enough, Cone felt confident about the campaign and the Edsel. Like a chess master who has no doubt that he will win, he could afford to explicate the brilliance of his moves even as he made them. Automobile men still talk, with admiration for the virtuosity displayed and a shudder at the ultimate outcome of the Edsel division's drive to round up retail dealers. Ordinarily, an established manufacturer launches a new car through dealers who are already handling his other makes and who, to begin with, take on the upstart as a sort of sideline. Not so in the case of the Edsel. Craft received authorization from on high to go all out and build up a retail dealer organization by making raids on dealers who had contracts with other manufacturers or even with the other Ford Company divisions, Ford and Lincoln, Mercury. Although the Ford dealers thus corralled were not obliged to cancel their old contracts, all the emphasis was on signing up retail outlets exclusively dedicated to the selling of Edsels. The goal set for Introduction Day, which after a great deal of soul searching was finally established as September 4, 1957, was 1,200 Edsel dealers from coast to coast. They were not to be just any dealers either. Craft made it clear that Edsel was interested in signing up only dealers whose records showed that they had a marked ability to sell cars without resorting to the high-pressure tricks of borderline legality that had lately been giving the automobile business a bad name. "We simply have to have quality dealers with quality service facilities," Craft said. "A customer who gets poor service on an established brand blames the dealer. On an Edsel, he will blame the car." The goal of 1,200 was a high one, for no dealer, quality or not, can afford to switch makes lightly. The average dealer has at least $100,000 tied up in his agency, and in large cities the investment is much higher. He must hire salesmen, mechanics, and office help, buy his own tools, technical literature, and signs, the latter costing as much as $5,000 a set, and pay the factory spot cash for the cars he receives from it. The man charged with mobilizing an Edsel sales force along these exacting lines was J.C. Larry Doyle, who, as general sales and marketing manager of the division, ranked second to Crave himself. A veteran of 40 years with the Ford Company who had started with it as an office boy in Kansas City and had spent the intervening time mainly selling, Doyle was a maverick in his field. On the one hand, he had an air of kindness and consideration that made him the very antithesis of the glib, brash denizens of 1,000 automobile rows across the continent. And on the other, he did not trouble to conceal an old-time salesman's skepticism about such things as analyzing the sexism, and status of automobiles, a pursuit he characterized by saying, "When I play pool, I like to keep one foot on the floor." Still, he knew how to sell cars, and that was what the Edsel division needed. Recalling how he and his sales staff brought off the unlikely trick of persuading substantial and reputable men who had already achieved success in one of the toughest of all businesses to tear up profitable franchises in favor of a risky new one, Doyle said not long ago, as soon as the first few new Edsels came through early in 1957, we put a couple of them in each of our 5 regional sales offices. Needless to say, we kept those offices locked and the blinds drawn. Dealers in every make for miles around wanted to see the car, if only out of curiosity, and that gave us the leverage we needed. We let it be known that we would show the car only to dealers who were really interested in coming with us, and then we sent our regional field managers out to surrounding towns to try to line up the no. 1 dealer in each to see the cars. If we couldn't get no 1, we'd try for no 2. Anyway, we set things up so that no one got in to see the Edsel without listening to a complete 1-hour pitch on the whole situation by a member of our sales force. It worked very well. It worked so well that by midsummer 1957, it was clear that Edsel was going to have a lot of quality dealers on Introduction Day. In fact, it missed the goal of 1,200 by a couple of dozen. Indeed, some dealers and other makes were apparently so confident of the Edsel's success, or so bemused by the Doyle staff's pitch, that they were entirely willing to sign up after hardly more than a glance at the Edsel itself. Doyle's people urged them to study the car closely and kept reciting the litany of its virtues, but the prospective Edsel dealers would wave such protestations aside and demand a contract without further ado. In retrospect, it would seem that Doyle could have given lessons to the Pied Piper. Now that the Edsel was no longer the exclusive concern of Dearborn, the Ford Company was irrevocably committed to going ahead. Until Doyle went into action, the whole program could have been quietly dropped at any time at a word from top management. But once the dealers had been signed up, there was the matter of honoring your contract to put out a car, Crave has explained. The matter was attended to with dispatch. Early in June 1957, the company announced that of the $250 million it had set aside to defray the advance costs of the Edsel, $150 million was being spent on basic facilities, including the conversion of various Ford and Mercury plants to the needs of producing the new cars, $50 million on special Edsel tooling, and $50 million on initial advertising and promotion. In June 2, an Edsel destined to be the star of a television commercial for future release was stealthily transported in a closed van to Hollywood, where, on a locked soundstage patrolled by security guards, it was exposed to the cameras in the admiring presence of a few carefully chosen actors, who had sworn that their lips would be sealed from then until introduction day. For this delicate photographic operation, the Edsel division cannily enlisted the services of Cascade Pictures, which also worked for the Atomic Energy Commission, and, as far as is known, there were no unintentional leaks. We took all the same precautions we take for our AEC films, a grim Cascade official has since said. Within a few weeks, the Edsel division had 1,800 salaried employees and was rapidly filling some 15,000 factory jobs in the newly converted plants. On July 15, Edsels began rolling off assembly lines at Somerville, Massachusetts, Mahawa, New Jersey, Louisville, Kentucky, and San Jose, California. The same day, Doyle scored an important coup by signing up Charles Chrysler, a Manhattan dealer regarded as one of the country's foremost practitioners in his field, who had represented Oldsmobile, one of Edsel's self-designated rivals. Before heeding the siren song from Dearborn, on July 22nd, the first advertisement for the Edsel appeared, in Life, a 2-page spread in plain black and white. It was impeccably classic and calm, showing a car whooshing down a country highway at such high speed that it was an indistinguishable blur. Lately, some mysterious automobiles had been seen on the roads. The accompanying text was headed. It went on to say that the blur was an Edsel being road tested and concluded with the assurance the Edsel is on its way. 2 weeks later, a second ad appeared in Life, this one showing a ghostly-looking car covered with a white sheet, standing at the entrance to the Ford Styling Center. This time, the headline read, "A man in your town recently made a decision that will change his life." The decision, it was explained, was to become an Edsel dealer. Whoever wrote the ad cannot have known how truly he spoke. During the tense summer of 1957, the man of the hour at Edsel was C. Gayle Warnock, Director of Public Relations, whose duty was not so much to generate public interest in the forthcoming product, there being an abundance of that, as to keep the interest at white heat and readily convertible into a desire to buy one of the new cars on or after introduction day, or, as the company came to call it, Edsel Day. Warnock, a dapper, affable man with a tiny mustache, is a native of Converse, Indiana, who, long before Crav drafted him from the Ford office in Chicago, did a spot of publicity work for county fairs, a background that has enabled him to spice the honeyed smoothness of the modern public relation man with a touch of the old carnival pitchman's uninhibited spirit. Recalling his summons to Dearborn, Warnock says, "When Dick Crav hired me back in the fall of 1955, he told me, 'I want you to program the e-car publicity from now to introduction day.' I said, 'Frankly, Dick, what do you mean by program?' He said he meant to sort of space it out, starting at the end and working backward. This was something new to me. I was used to taking what breaks I could get when I could get them, but I soon found out how right Dick was. It was almost too easy to get publicity for the Edsel. Early in 1956, when it was still called the e-car, Crav gave a little talk about it out in Portland, Oregon. We didn't try for anything more than a play in the local press, but the wire services picked the story up and it went out all over the country. Clippings came in by the bushel. Right then I realized the trouble we might be headed for. The public was getting to be hysterical to see our car, figuring it was going to be some kind of dream car, like nothing they'd ever seen. I said to Crav, when they find out it's got 4 wheels and 1 engine, just like the next car, they're liable to be disappointed. It was agreed that the safest way to tread the tightrope between overplaying and underplaying the Edsel would be to say nothing about the car as a whole, but reveal its individual charms a little at a time. A sort of automotive strip tease, a phrase that Warnock couldn't with proper dignity use himself but was happy to see the New York Times use for him. The policy was later violated now and then, purposely or inadvertently. For one thing, as the pre-Edsel Day summer wore on, reporters prevailed upon Kraft to authorize Warnock to show the Edsel to them, one at a time, on what Warnock called a peekaboo, or you've seen Nint. Forget it basis. And for another, Edsels loaded on vans for delivery to dealers were appearing on the highways in ever-increasing numbers, covered fore and aft with canvas flaps that, as if to whet the desire of the motoring public, were forever blowing loose. That summer, too, was a time of speech-making by an Edsel foursome consisting of Kraft, Doyle, J. Emmett Judge, who is Edsel's Director of Merchandise and Product Planning, and Robert F. G. Copeland, its Assistant General Sales Manager for Advertising, Sales Promotion, and Training. Ranging separately up and down and across the nation, the four orators moved around so fast and so tirelessly that Warnock, lest he lose track of them, took to indicating their whereabouts with colored pins on a map in his office. Let's see, Kraft goes from Atlanta to New Orleans, Doyle from Council Bluffs to Salt Lake City. Warnock would muse of a morning in Dearborn, sipping his second cup of coffee and then getting up to yank the pins out and jab them in again. Although most of Kraft's audiences consisted of bankers and representatives of finance companies who it was hoped would lend money to Edsel dealers, his speeches that summer, far from echoing the general hoopla, were almost statesmanlike in their cautious, even somber references to the new cars' prospects. And while they might have been, for developments in the general economic outlook of the nation were making more sanguine men than Kraft look puzzled. In July 1957, the stock market went into a nosedive, marking the beginning of what is recalled as the recession of 1958. Then, early in August, a decline in the sales of medium-priced 1957 cars of all makes set in, and the general situation worsened so rapidly that, before the month was out, Automotive News reported that dealers in all makes were ending their season with the second largest number of unsold new cars in history. If Kraft, on his lonely rounds, ever considered retreating to Dearborn for consolation, he was forced to put that notion out of his mind when, also in August, Mercury, Edsel's own stablemate, served notice that it was going to make things as tough as possible for the newcomer by undertaking a $1 million 30-day advertising drive aimed especially at price-conscious buyers. A clear reference to the fact that the 1957 Mercury, which was then being sold at a discount by most dealers, cost less than the new Edsel was expected to. Meanwhile, sales of the Rambler, which was the only American-made small car then in production, were beginning to rise ominously. In the face of all these evil portents, Kraft fell into the habit of ending his speeches with a rather downbeat anecdote about the board chairman of an unsuccessful dog food company who said to his fellow directors, "Gentlemen, let's face facts. Diggs don't like our product." As far as we're concerned, Kraft added on at least one occasion, driving home the morale with admirable clarity. A lot will depend on whether people like our car or not, but most of the other Edsel men were unimpressed by Kraft's misgivings. Perhaps the least impressed of all was Judge, who, while doing his bit as an itinerant speaker, specialized in community and civic groups. Undismayed by the limitations of the striptease policy, Judge brightened up his lectures by showing such a bewildering array of animated graphs, cartoons, charts, and pictures of parts of the cars, all flashed on a cinemascope screen, that his listeners usually got halfway home before they realized that he hadn't shown them an Edsel. He wandered restlessly around the auditorium as he spoke, shifting the kaleidoscopic images on the screen at will with the aid of an automatic slide changer, a trick made possible by a crew of electricians who laced the place in advance with a maze of wires linking the device to dozens of floor switches which, scattered about the hall, responded when he kicked them. Each of the Judge spectaculars, as these performances came to be known, cost the Edsel division $5,000. A sum that included the pay and expenses of the technical crew who would arrive on the scene a day or so ahead of time to set up the electrical rig. At the last moment, Judge would descend melodramatically on the town biplane, hasten to the hall, and go into his act. One of the greatest aspects of this whole Edsel program is the philosophy of product and merchandising behind it. Judge might start off with a desultory kick at a switch here, a switch there. All of us who have been a part of it are real proud of this background, and we are anxiously awaiting its success when the car is introduced this fall. Never again will we be associated with anything as gigantic and full of meaning as this particular program. Here is a glimpse of the car which will be before the American public on September 4, 1957, and at this point, Judge would show a provocative slide of a hubcap or section of fenders. It is a different car in every respect, yet it has an element of conservatism which will give it maximum appeal. Distinctiveness of the frontal styling integrates with the sculpted patterns of the side treatment. And on Judge would rhapsodize, rolling out such awesome phrases as sculptured sheet metal, highlight character, and graceful, flowing lines. At last would come the ringing peroration. "We are proud of the Edsel," he would cry, kicking switches right and left. When it is introduced this fall, it will take its place on the streets and highways of America, bringing new greatness to the Ford Motor Company. This is the Edsel story. The drumroll climax of the striptease was a 3-day press preview of the Edsel undraped from pinched and snout to flaring rear that was held in Detroit and Dearborn on August 26th, 27th, and 28th, with 250 reporters from all over the country in attendance. It differed from previous automotive jamborees of its kind in that the journalists were invited to bring their wives along, and many of them did. Before it was over, it had cost the Ford Company $90,000. Grand as it was, the conventionality of its setting was a disappointment to Warnock, who had proposed and seen rejected 3 locales that he thought would provide a more offbeat ambience. A steamer on the Detroit River, wrong symbolism, East Seal, Kentucky, inaccessible by road, and hey, just turned down flat. Thus hobbled, Warnock could do no better for the reporters and their wives when they converged on the Detroit scene on Sunday evening, August 25th, than to put them up at the discouragingly named Sheraton Cadillac Hotel and to arrange for them to spend Monday afternoon hearing and reading about the long-awaited details of the entire crop of Edsels, 18 varieties available in 4 main lines, Corsair, Citation, Pacer, and Ranger, differing mainly in their size, power, and trunk. The next morning, specimens of the models themselves were revealed to the reporters in the Styling Center's rotunda, and Henry offered a few words of tribute to his father. The wives were not asked to the unveiling. A Foot Cone man who helped plan the affair recalled, "It was too solemn and businesslike an event for that. It went over fine." There was excitement even among the hardened newspapermen. The import of the stories that most of the excited newspapermen filed was that the Edsel seemed to be a good car, though not so radical as its billing had suggested. In the afternoon, the reporters were whisked out to the test track to see a team of stunt drivers put the Edsel through its paces. This event, calculated to be thrilling, turned out to be hair-raising and even, for some, a little unstringing, enjoined not to talk too much about speed and horsepower, since only a few months previously the whole automobile industry had nobly resolved to concentrate on making cars instead of delayed action bombs. Warnock had decided to emphasize the Edsel's liveliness through deeds rather than words, and to accomplish this, he had hired a team of stunt drivers. Edsels ran over 2-foot ramps on 2 wheels, bounced from height. Ramps on all 4 wheels were driven in crisscross patterns, grazing each other at 60 or 70 miles per hour, and skidded into complete turns at 50. For comic relief, there was a clown driver parodying the Daredevil stuff. All the while, the voice of Neil L. Bloom, Edsel's engineering chief, could be heard on a loudspeaker purring about the capabilities, the safety, the ruggedness, the maneuverability and performance of these new cars, and skirting the words speed and horsepower as delicately as a sandpiper skirts a wave. At one point, when an Edsel leaping a high ramp just missed turning over, Kraft's face took on a ghastly pallor. He later reported that he had not known the Daredevil stunts were going to be so extreme, and was concerned both for the good name of the Edsel and the lives of the drivers. Warnock, noticing his boss's distress, went over and asked Kraft if he was enjoying the show. Kraft replied tersely that he would answer when it was over and all hands safe. But everyone else seemed to be having a grand time. The Foot Cone man said, "You looked over this green Michigan hill, and there were those glorious Edsels performing gloriously in unison. It was beautiful. It was like the Rockettes. It was exciting. Morale was high." Warnock's high spirits had carried him to even wilder extremes of fancy. The stunt driving, like the unveiling, was considered too rich for the blood of the wives, but the resourceful Warnock was ready for them with a fashion show that he hoped they would find at least equally diverting. He need not have worried. The star of the show, who was introduced by Brown, the Edsel stylist, as a Paris couturière, both beautiful and talented, turned out at the final curtain to be a female impersonator, a fact of which Warnock, to heighten the verisimilitude of the act, had given Brown no advance warning. Things were never again quite the same since between Brown and Warnock. But the wives were able to give their husbands an extra paragraph or two for their stories. That evening, there was a big gala for one and all at the Styling Center, which was itself styled as a nightclub for the occasion, complete with a fountain that danced in time with the music of Ray McKinley's band, whose emblem, the letters GEM, a holdover from the days of its founder, the late Glenn Miller, was emblazoned as usual on the music stand of each musician, very nearly ruining the evening for Warnock. The next morning, at a wind-up press conference held by Ford officials, Breech declared of the Edsel, "It's a husky youngster, and, like most other new parents, we're proud enough to pop our buttons." Then 71 of the reporters took the wheels of his many Edsels and set out for home, not to drive the cars into their garages, but to deliver them to the showrooms of their local Edsel dealer. Let Warnock describe the highlights of this final flourish. There were several unfortunate occurrences. One guy simply miscalculated and cracked up his car running into something. No fault of the Edsel Air. One car lost its oil pan, so naturally the motor froze. It can happen to the best of cars. Fortunately, at the time of this malfunction, the driver was going through a beautiful sounding town, Paradise, Kansas, I think it was, and that gave the news reports about it a nice little positive touch. The nearest dealer gave the reporter a new Edsel, and he drove on home, climbing Pikes Peak on the way. Then one car crashed through a toll gate when the brakes failed. That was bad. It's funny, but the thing we were most worried about, other drivers being so eager to get a look at the Edsels that they'd crowd our cars off the road, happened only once. That was on the Pennsylvania Turnpike. One of our reporters was tooling along. No problems. When a Plymouth driver pulled up alongside to rubberneck and edged so close that the Edsel got sideswiped. Minor damage. Latte in 1959, immediately after the demise of the Edsel Business Week, stated that at the big press preview, a Ford executive had said to a reporter, "If the company weren't in so deep, we never would have brought it out now, however, since Business Week neglected to publish this." Patently sensational statement for over 2 years. And since to this day, all the former ranking Edsel executives, Crabb included notwithstanding his preoccupation with the luckless dog, Food Company firmly maintained that right up to Edsel Day and even for a short time thereafter they expect the Edsel to succeed, it would seem that the quotation should be regarded as a highly suspect archaeological find. Indeed, during the period between the press preview and Edsel Day, the spirit of everybody associated with the venture seems to have been one of wild optimism. Oldsmobile Goodbye ran the headline on an ad in the Detroit Free Press for an agency that was switching from Olds to Edsel. A dealer in Portland, Oregon, reported that he had already sold 2 Edsels, sight unseen. Warnock dug up a fireworks company in Japan willing to make him at $9 apiece, 5,000 rockets that, exploding in midair, would release 9-foot scale. Model Edsels made of rice paper that would inflate and descend like parachutes. His head reeling with visions of filling America's skies as well as its highways with Edsels on Edsel Day. Warnock was about to dash off an order when Crabb, looking something more than puzzled, shook his head. On September 3rd, E-Day -1, the prices of the various Edsel models were announced. For cars delivered to New York, they ran from just under $2,800 to just over $4,100. On A-Day, the Edsel arrived. In Cambridge, a band led a gleaming motorcade of the new cars up Massachusetts Avenue. Flying out of Richmond, California, a helicopter hired by one of the most jubilant of the dealers, lassoed by Doyle, spread a giant Edsel sign above San Francisco Bay and all over the nation, from the Louisiana Bayous to the peak of Mount Rainier to the Maine woods. One needed only a radio or a television set to know that the very air, despite Warnock's setback on the rockets, was quivering with the presence of the Edsel. The tone for Edsel Day's blizzard of publicity was set by an ad published in newspapers all over the country, in which the Edsel shared the spotlight with the Ford Company's president Ford and chairman Breech. In the ad, Ford looked like a dignified young father, Breech like a dignified gentleman holding a full house against a possible straight. The Edsel just looked like an Edsel. The accompanying text declared that the decision to produce the car had been based on what we knew, guessed, felt, believed, suspected about you, and added you are the reason behind the Edsel. The tone was calm and confident. There did not seem to be much room for doubt about the reality of that full house. Before sundown, it was estimated 2,850,000 people had seen the new car in dealers' showrooms. 3 days later, in North Philadelphia, an Edsel was stolen. It can reasonably be argued that the crime marked the high-water mark of public acceptance of the Edsel. Only a few months later, any but the least fastidious of car thieves might not have bothered. Decline and fall. The most striking physical characteristic of the Edsel was, of course, its radiator grille. This, in contrast to the wide and horizontal grilles of all 19 other American makes of the time, was slender and vertical. Of chromium-plated steel and shaped something like an egg, it sat in the middle of the car's front end and was embellished by the word Edsel in aluminum letters running down its length. It was intended to suggest the front end of practically any car of 20 or 30 years ago, and of most contemporary European cars, and thus to look at once seasoned and sophisticated. The trouble was that whereas the front ends of the antiques in the European cars were themselves high and narrow, consisting indeed of little more than the radiator grilles, the front end of the Edsel was broad and low, just like the front ends of all its American competitors. Consequently, there were wide areas on either side of the grille that had to be filled in with something, and filled in they were with twin panels of entirely conventional horizontal chrome grillework. The effect was that of an Oldsmobile with the prow of a Pierce arrow implanted in its front end, or, more metaphorically, of the charwoman trying on the Duchess necklace. The attempt at sophistication was so transparent as to be endearing. But if the grille